Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Mohammed Aman. I am the Global Network Associate of the Global Legal Empowerment Network based in Kenya. It's Thursday, March 21st, and today we're joined by Malini Ramalho, Irina Alexeva, and Mariama Farah for sharing learnings based on their Citizenship Learning Exchange in Kenya last year. Before we get too far into today's presentation, I have some brief housekeeping items. Firstly, take note that this event is being recorded and we will share the full recording and highlights later on our website. I also want to make sure you can hear well and are able to use our webinar system. You will see a questions panel where you can type in your comments and communicate with us. There is also a button for raising your hand to get our attention. Feel free to try it now. Please type in your comments, ideas, suggestions, best practices in the questions panel as we move along. We want to hear from you. We will also have questions for discussion in the second half of the webinar. Please bear with us as my colleagues respond to your various requests and comments. Tobias and Madeline from the network will be fielding your questions and today and taking notes. I'd also like to introduce you to the Global Legal Empowerment Network. The network is a growing community of now more than 1,800 organizations and 6,000 individuals from around the globe who are working to advance justice. Members include human rights activists and grassroots organizers, advocates and educators, lawyers and community paralegals, researchers, policymakers, and public servants. Through the network, these practitioners are able to come together to collaborate and learn from each other, both online and through in-person events. We share ideas, challenges, best practices, and resources. Last year, members of the network launched the Justice for All campaign, calling on world leaders to increase financing and protection for grassroots justice defenders. You can join the network on our website at namati.org. Membership is free and open to all. Just complete a short sign-up form on the site after this webinar. We will share the link to join if you're interested. We'd love to have you in our community. A brief introduction to our webinar. In October 2018, the Global Legal Empowerment Network and Namati Kenya through the Citizenship program hosted a citizenship learning exchange in Nairobi between the 7th to the 19th that brought together 19 participants from 13 countries across Africa, Asia, and Europe. The focus of the exchange was built around sharing knowledge and experience around citizenship and legal empowerment, including methods, skills, and strategies with other members, improving conceptual understanding of both citizenship work and legal empowerment, identifying concrete actions to take forward to improve upon individual and organizational challenges outlined in work plans, to share collective valuable insights and practices with the broader Legal Empowerment Network, and to introduce the Global Legal Empowerment Network and create a cadre of core active members working on citizenship, including identifying potential activities to carry forward as a group. I am now pleased to introduce Malini, Irina, and Mariama, who will facilitate the discussion for the rest of the webinar. You will hear from me at the end towards wrapping up, and otherwise only if I need to jump in to help out. Quick introductions. Malini Ramalho is a Senior Manager for Social Protection at DRA, Malaysia, and is the focal resource person for government agencies, UN agencies, media agencies, and other stakeholders in the issue of statelessness in Malaysia. She has experience working with persons at risk of statelessness and lawyers who provide legal assistance, and is responsible for coordinating and implementing the mapping and registration project by community-based paralegals. Irina Alexeva is a project manager with Right to Protection, a non-profit organization in Ukraine focused on the protection of human rights and government's capacity building. As a former litigation and arbitration lawyer with the background in commercial and contractual disputes and insolvency law, she has profound knowledge of public international law and law of international organizations. And finally, Mariama Farah is a citizenship and policy advocate who has worked with the Somali government to develop their citizenship laws and policy development guidelines. She works with Haki na Sharia initiative in Garissa, Kenya, which has informed her presentation today. Her work focuses primarily on citizenship rights of pastoralist communities in the North Horn of Kenya. I would now like to invite Malini to take us through her presentation.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanking the Global Legal Empowerment Network and the MATI for the opportunity in selecting Draw Malaysia in its first learning exchange focused on citizenship and legal identity last year, October, in Kenya. The whole learning exchange was such a rewarding and distinctive experience. You can imagine the extent of information and experience was afloat with 19 practitioners from 13 countries. During my field assignment, I was assigned to the Human Rights Forum to host my learning experience. Next slide, please. NRF operates from a compact office located in Kibera, a bigger slum in Africa, also among the largest in the world, largely populated by the Nubians who were brought to Kenya over 100 years ago by the British and have been treated as foreigners ever since. Because of their ethnic and religious origin, they are forced to go through a lengthy vetting process in order to obtain the ID cards and that are essential for everyday life. I noted that the NRF office proximity was within the population being addressed, such a simple way to allow the community to be aware that they are just one step away from accessing assistance from NRF. The major takeaway I had was during my time at Huduma Center. Next, please. A center established to enhance the access and delivery of government services in Kenya. I was able to speak to the Council of Elders of the Kenyan Nubian. The Nubian applicants are required to appear before the Council of Elders for vetting. I saw the possibility in the implementation of the similar vetting system in Malaysia, especially to address stateless cases with almost all missing documents and proof, so that the council could assist in verifying the origin and attest the genuineness. In other words, it could be a tribunal. The platform also provided me with an opportunity to learn tactics for high-level advocacy, including using grassroots data to call for a change in policy and practice from the fellow practitioners globally. Next slide. Sharing a non-fun fact, Asia-Pacific region has the largest proportion of stateless persons than any other region in the world. So if you can look at the presentation, yes. So next slide. Sharing my home country, Malaysia's successes in mapping and registration of the pre-independence rural communities who arrived and born before 1957 in West Malaysia through our community-based paralegal, leading up to several initiatives by the rural government through mass registration campaigns and accepting that statelessness is one of the key areas to be addressed within its recent election manifesto or in the past to be included within the Malaysian Indian blueprint, which otherwise would not have been possible without data collection. Data collection also allowed us to access the impact of certain nationality law and procedures in practice, continuing to cause statelessness beyond the pre-independence community. During our discussion as well, we spoke how Sri Lanka used to be one of the largest stateless population in the world, mostly the Hills Tamils being brought from India by the British colonizers between 1820 to 1840 to work on the coffee and the tea plantations in Sri Lanka. In October 2003, the Sri Lankan Parliament passed the Grant of Citizenship to Persons of Indian Origin Act. With that, all stateless persons of Indian origin who had lived in Sri Lanka since October 30th, 1964 and their descendants will be granted Sri Lankan citizenship if they wish. And the best part of all, close to 200,000 stateless people received citizenship within 10 days. Further, we learned about the Thailand stateless population, mostly made up of the indigenous hill tribe groups living in the mountainous region bordering countries such as Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Many were deprived of Thai nationality as a result of border demarcation in 1904 and certain legislative amendment in 1972. Following important reforms in the Thailand nationality and civil registration law, the adoption of the progressive nationality strategy to address statelessness, 23,000 registered stateless persons have acquired Thai nationality since 2011. This exchange, this global exchange that we had further reaffirmed my belief that addressing statelessness was merely a political will and solution is definitely within the reach. Further, we also discussed the importance of network correlation to bring together experts pool. Next slide, please. Let it be formal or informal, setup um, of such. SNAP was launched in November 2016. SNAP stands for Statelessness Network Asia Pacific. It is currently hosted by DRA Malaysia. It is a civil society coalition composed of 300 organizations and individual experts, with 50 organizations and individuals actively involved in SNAP activities. There are many examples across Asia and the Pacific where civil society, in collaboration with governments and UN agencies, have successfully addressed statelessness for specific population. But most of the time, it seemed like it wasn't recorded or it wasn't spoken in a platform where everyone could exchange the information. So SNAP was having a goal that is to promote collaboration and information sharing on addressing statelessness in Asia and the Pacific anytime. Part of the other interesting observation I had was most large-scale and trend situation of statelessness in the world today were born of the experience of colonization, decolonization, and consequent nation building. Next slide, please. In such contexts, newly independent states have had to deal with borders arbitrarily drawn, often dividing ethnic groups. People forcibly migrate for labor, and the consequences are for decades. Sometimes centuries of colonial rule will successfully pit different ethnic and religious groups against each other, privileging some and marginalizing others as part of a wider divide and rule policy. It is not surprising that many newly independent states thus struggled with nation building and national identity and the treatment of minorities. The historical content must be understood and addressed in order to reduce statelessness adequately. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely presentation, Malini. If you have any questions for her, please share them with us through the comments panel, and we will get to them during our question and answer portion of the webinar. I would now like to invite Irina to take us through her presentation. Welcome, Irina.
Hello everyone from Ukraine. I would like to thank both Mohammed and Malini for the introduction, our presentation, and for the words of gratitude. It was a really incredible experience for me in Africa last October, and in my presentation I will highlight the major insights from the exchange. So I would like to start with the fact that during the exchange, I was a part of the group of paralegals counseling on the issues of nationality and documentation in Malindi. In particular, it was a small group consisting of me and another participant from Uganda. We traveled together with Namati team and Hockey Center paralegals across the region and distant settlement where people resettled for the period of flood. Also, we visited the primary school that led us evidence that the need for paralegals work is there because some children did not have birth certificates at all. And coming back to mobile visits of paralegals, accompanied by the state officials who are in charge of birth registration and issuing ID cards, I particularly appreciated the active engagement of public registrars and officials in the field work, as well as local chiefs' prompt feedback concerning the proof of applicants' actual residency and timeframes for collecting ID cards and birth certificates. Indisputably, the field activity was coherent due to diligent planning and organization on the part of Hockey Center and its devoted paralegals. Being inspired by the mentioned visit and their deliverables for population, upon arrival to Ukraine after the learning exchange, the organization that I work for, Right to Protection, included community work to its project activities on statelessness. Another observation is that we divided this engagement of paralegals for two steps. The first one, we want to engage current and former clients in the counseling on general procedure for birth registration and passportization. And as the second step, we will work on the set of soft skills training targeting selected paralegals on the issues of nationality. Another experience that I took from Kenya and decided to borrow for Ukraine is the great idea of organizing mobile visits by the migration authorities in Ukraine to the settlements where people with documentation concerns reside compactly. As you might heard, in Ukraine there has been war in the east of the country and it has lasted for fifth year, and many people are suffering drastically from its consequences, particularly because of the armed conflict in the east of the country. Certain its parts are affected by the war, and many people who reside in unsafe zones have no access to the administrative services on birth registration and passports in a short distance. This is why at the moment Right to Protection pilots mobile services by migration authorities of Ukraine to the conflict-affected population. That is a direct reflection on learning exchange experience. For example, last week our organization was a host for the coordination meeting with migration authorities and other relevant stakeholders like homeless people, social care administrative centers. Concerning the birth registration and what I learned in Kenya, I would like to emphasize the work of paralegals at the hospitals, as I mentioned in the beginning. This approach is proactive, as the certificate on birth is the first document containing the data on child's place of birth, parents, and their nationality. Having that, a child can prove the link with the state by either the law of blood or the law of soil. At the hospitals, paralegals in Kenya provided counseling on the procedure for birth registration, which depends on the documents available with the parents. And what is important is that to follow up on the cases, the paralegals of Hockey Center register them in the database Salesforce and then get back to verify if the child's birth was registered. That in the end ensures proper case monitoring. And that observation was also quite useful and practicable for me as a project manager, since the use of data appeared to be the key to accurate reporting and proper case management. And taking the opportunity being a panelist for this presentation, I would like also to share with you the update from the Ukrainian legislation and it concerns the prospectful adoption of the statelessness determination procedure. Currently, there is the draft law before the Ukrainian parliament, and it calls for the procedure for stateless people in migration to be able to be recognized as stateless. In case that law is adopted, thousands of irregular migrants who are stateless and who find themselves in Ukraine will be able to be recognized as stateless people and obtain residence permit that will enable them to exercise their basic rights and freedoms. For Ukraine, this is the 5th year that the country is a party to the international conventions on statelessness. Nevertheless, that period was not enough to fully implement its international obligations. Thank you.
It was a perfect presentation, but you forgot to ask me to advance the slides. So I'll advance them now slowly so everybody can take a look.
I would like to, if
And
possible, I would like to comment on the previous one. This is the picture of fieldwork activity that we practice in Ukraine, and the man whom you see on the slide is homeless, and he lives in the hatchway underground, and we just took the picture when a lawyer is taking an interview from this man. Next slide, please. And this photo depicts the family of stateless people. They are of Roma ethnicity, and we provided assistance to the father, formerly stateless man, and after obtaining the passport, we engaged him as a paralegal, and thanks to obtaining passport, he was able to be registered as father for his children, because before that his paternity was not recognized. So it's really the impact of identity document is incredible. Next slide, please. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and that was it. And I just want to point out, this is Tobias speaking, that we're going to put these slides up on the forum topic devoted to this webinar afterwards, so people can come and check them out later. Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you, Tobias, for catching that. And Irina, thank you for your lovely presentation and insights on your work. It's particularly inspiring to see that clients who you served can come back and become paralegals themselves. So if you have any questions for Irina, please share them with us through the comments panel, and we will get to them and address them during our question and answer portion of the webinar. I would now like to invite our final presenter, Mariama Farah from Hakina Sharia, to take us through our presentation. Welcome, Mariama.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for putting this together and for organizing the exchange last year. We were one of the host communities, so we benefited from real-time change to some of our programs, because all the advice that we were getting from everybody, we were able to kind of implement it as we worked. So I'll be talking about something that we've been grappling with in northern Kenya. Hakina Sharia operates out of Garissa, which is in the northeast of Kenya, and it hosts one of the largest refugee camps in the world. What's very particular about this camp is that the refugees and the hosts share one ethnicity. As Malini rightly pointed out, there have been a lot of arbitrary colonial borders, and one of these borders cut the Somali community in half. So some of them are in what we now recognize as Somalia, and some of them are in Kenya. The last elections, before this new government came in, they presented a lot of promises that people who are suffering from what we call double registration will have an opportunity to remove themselves from the refugee database. A double registered person is a person who is of Kenyan nationality, but who has registered themselves in the UNHCR database. So the government promised that they would give a grace period for people to be able to remove themselves from the database and be able to access citizenship documents for Kenya, primarily the national ID, which is something that is extremely important for um, opening a bank account, accessing tertiary education, or accessing loans. It's one of the most important documents to have in Kenya. And as of right now, if you have been registered in the refugee database, you're not able to access these citizenship documents. Sorry, next two slides, I think. So what we do, oh yeah, so the refugees are able to access things like food rations, and they have good education systems. And since Garissa has been historically, economically, and politically marginalized, the prospect of being able to access these kind of regular food rations and good education is something that's pushed people to want to register themselves as refugees. And this is something that we found our work as paralegals and advocates is where we start now basing our discussion. Why did these people join the camps? What is the reason that really pushed them to effectively declare themselves Somali citizens, fleeing the situation in Somalia when they're actually Kenyans? And one of the biggest reasons we found was the drought in 1992. So when we go back to our database, we find that a lot of the people that we're working with registered themselves and their children during this period of drought because there was no option really. There was food in the camps, they had no food, and they had no real option to access that food. Next slide. One thing we try to tell them is that there are legal implications when they register as a Somali citizen. It becomes difficult now for the Kenyan registration office to try and recognize them again, and that's the reason why a lot of their papers are delayed or even completely barred. So when they try to apply for a national ID, they're closed off from the operation because their name comes up in the UN database. Next slide, please. What we do with the paralegals is we go into the communities, we give them information on, and the next slide as well, please, thank you. We give them information on the laws. So this would be the registration law, the Constitution of Kenya, as well as the different policies that Kenya uses. Next slide, please. One thing that we were able to really get from this, the learning exchange that we're still implementing right now, is dedicating our community visits to either civic education or registration or data collection. Because previously what we've been doing is a kind of catch-all where we plan to go into the community and we do as much as possible while we're there. The delegates that we hosted brought up that, well, this is a good strategy to get as much done as we can. Unfortunately, it's not as effective as we might want it to be. So as of right now, we're actually implementing these dedicated community visits. So we'll have one day in the week, we'll go for just civic education in one particular community. And then at the end of the week, we'll go to another community and give them, we'll go to collect data from them. Who's registered in a refugee database? How can we help them? Next slide, please. Something that we also learned is perhaps it's not always about just giving them the education. Sometimes we have to take that next step, the proactive step. So what we're doing now is kind of putting together a litigation strategy, how we can now help these people present their case before the government as people who are registered in the refugee camps, yes, but they have documents proving that they're Kenyan, either their parents' identity cards or even a birth certificate. Some of them have birth certificates and they're still denied access to other citizenship documents. So we're now trying to present a litigation strategy, hopefully by the end of this year. Next slide, please. Oh, I think I'm done. I think this is for Mohammed. I'll leave it to him.
That was the last slide.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariam, for those insights on double registration, which is still a very unknown phenomenon for most of the people. I know that if you have any questions for Mariama, please share them with us and we will get to them during the question and answer portion of the webinar. I would now like to go ahead and open up the floor for discussions and questions. Please feel free to use the raise your hand button and share any question that you may have. Please feel free. Any questions? If I should add, so this webinar actually, as you know, it's based on the learning exchange last year, and the interesting bit that I think I'm capturing from some of the presentations is that one of the things that made the participants had in common was the fact that they all had some semblance of, as Malini mentioned in her presentation, colonialism background. So that I thought I found quite interesting for me. And maybe just share with us from wherever you're seated at if that has as well played a role in the context of the work that you do.
Well, this is Tobias jumping in. It looks like only Sunitha Bisan has discovered the questions pane. Thank you so much for your questions. Mohammed, I wonder, didn't you still have some material that you wanted to introduce now? Maybe you could go ahead and continue while people look for and find the questions pane and ask their questions.
Yeah, sure, Tobias. I think I was setting this up for like a sort of wrap up of the webinar, but I can go ahead and share a few of my presentations as we let people get acquainted with the questions panel and their own questions. So this final bit of presentations I'll be doing myself, and it's basically a consolidation of some of the best practices and the key learnings from the 2018 Citizenship Exchange. So I will primarily, next slide please, Tobias. Yeah, so I will primarily be focusing on about 6 areas, and that's one, I'll be talking about community education as a best practice, strategic litigation, strategic and effective communication, strategic programming for advocacy, importance of data, and paralegal capacity development. Next slide, please. Yeah, so on community education, we talked about something that came out clearly was how we involve stakeholders in community education. And so a lesson that we learned from a participant from Uganda, Uzoma, was that they were using elders, chiefs and community elders in terms of mobilizing people and helping them share the information to the public on their citizenship and housing rights. So they even went ahead to develop IEC materials like brochures that they shared with us. As you can see, I have here featured one IAC material that the citizenship team in Kenya is using with their program partners. And they have developed a series of flip charts that talk to the community about their rights and how they can follow procedures for application, including the documents that are required during this process. So it has been instrumental in helping them when they have convenings, for example, like they have what you'd call town hall meetings, but they call them community forums, where a number of people in the community come in and share, and they empower them with the process and procedure applications while focusing on the law. The third thing on community education is also to make use of important resources like, for example, one thing that informed the exchange was the recently launched Citizenship Practitioners Guide that is of course, available in our website in the Global Legal Empowerment Network and the resource library. So this had some best practices based on research, some of the procedures and steps toward building community paralegal programs and working on citizenship rights. Another final medium in community education that was informed was the use of radio as a mass awareness and education platform. So this was so effective based on what Nubian Rights Forum and Haki na Sharia have used as platforms to share, that one of the participants from the learning exchange, Yadana from the Braveheart Foundation in Myanmar, went ahead to share that particular learning and started a radio presentation program. Next slide, please, Tobias. So the next thing I wanted to highlight as a best practice was the use of strategic litigation. This, we talked about it quite a bit, and it's basically just making sure that you're addressing a wider issue through picking strategic cases that will likely present a bit more to the community, and they will then leverage their interest in that particular case in learning more about the work that you do. An example I can give is, for example, in Kenya, collective casework by the Nubian Rights Forum and this concept of strategic litigation went ahead, the Nubian Rights Forum went ahead to file a petition against the government of Kenya in regard to the new national integrated identity management system that was just launched a few months ago, that looks basically to create a digital register without addressing issues that are prevalent on discrimination and exclusion. Some of them include the fact that there are no data rights laws, data protection laws within the country that would then protect this huge data that people are collecting. So there's a lot that should be shared on that particular case, and you can find that link again in our website, where we've talked about it extensively, and there are discussions on that particular case that is going on in the whole digital ID initiative in Kenya. Next slide, please. So the next thing I wanted to highlight as a best practice based on that exchange was the strategic communications aspect. And here I'll focus on two things specifically. I'll focus on use of stories and use of creating and having an online platform. So as far as story is concerned, the photo on the left part of the screen is a book shared to us by Lisa Muller of the Lawyers for Human Rights based in South Africa, who was also part of the exchange. And she had very good insights into how we can package our stories and share communication materials with stakeholders, with partners, and the communities even. So the book called Childhood Statelessness in South Africa basically is a short stories book that shares stories of the victims through images of children who have been found stateless or are affected by that scourge in South Africa. We find that stories can be very effective as far as sharing with people, communities, and even stakeholders, because they are more relatable and emotive, and they get the point across easily. They more often than not enable people to empathize with unfamiliar people that they may not have interacted with before, places and situations, and they'll continue to offer those insights into different conditions and values. Think of it, if you're simply given a numbered list with random values, it's not easy to identify with it. On the right-hand side, as I mentioned, we basically focused on developing a communication strategy. And that is using, for example, social media, your web platform, and any other medium to draw attention into the work that you're currently doing. If I could share an example, for example, Nubian Rights Forum right now is doing that in linking their petition on the National Integrated Identity Management System with their social media and their Twitter. Next slide, please.
Just want to point out, Mohammed, that you're running a bit over on time, and we have questions coming in now.
Thank you, Tobias. I'll be wrapping up in like 3 or 4 minutes. Next slide.
That means you'll use twice as much time as everybody else. So you got to, just a note. Good stuff, though.
Next
Carry
slide.
on. I wonder
slide.
if okay, go ahead. Go ahead. We're getting a lot of questions, which I appreciate. We want to continue to have more questions. Please continue to ask. We'll try to get to everything, but as these webinars tend to go, sometimes we run over on time. Maybe we'll take another 10 minutes at the end. I hope everybody doesn't mind, in order to continue the discussion. And then whatever we don't cover during the webinar, we'll take to the forum and we'll continue the discussion there. So carry on, Mohammed.
Okay, next slide, Tobias. So I have talked a bit about strategic communications. Next slide. So the other thing I wanted to highlight really quickly was strategic programming and advocacy. And for this, it's basically putting a focus more on how we program for making sure that we can leverage, for example, a few things that happen for us in the work that we are currently doing. So number one, I can share an experience from the Braveheart Foundation, Yadana again, and Lalita from Adra in Thailand, who then went ahead to do their own paralegal exchange based on their learnings from this paralegal exchange that we had in Kenya. They exchanged paralegals and they did like a whole thing. The next thing I'll mention that we identified is how to leverage fundraising, given that the work that we do doesn't have a lot of attention and resources in the citizenship and statelessness spheres. One thing that we can focus on is targeting conventionals, so meetings and convenings that are held within our regions that we could go ahead and share the work that we're currently doing on citizenship and statelessness. Again, these are lessons that we learned from South Africa, who have used every avenue they have to prepare their booklets and share it with other stakeholders. Again, based on advocacy, one strategy that we felt worked very well was to report to treaty bodies. And this basically creates external pressure to duty bearers and the people involved. For example, using the African Community on Experts and Rights of the Welfare and the Children, the African courts, and using even the voluntary national review process continues to build attention to citizenship and statelessness issues within the country. Next slide, please. The final thing was to talk about the importance of data. And really quickly, we explored the use of data as important towards building evidence, strengthening investment in the project by making sure people understand why we're collecting this data. It also presents us with an opportunity for close monitoring and evaluation, for documentation purposes, including sharing our reports with donors and other people, and to also share, to come up with policy briefs. This informed the Nubian Miners versus Kenya decision, if I can take an example, that was brought to the African Courts on the Rights and the Welfare of the Child that challenged the Kenyan government to address discrimination of the Nubian community. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in wrapping up, I'll just touch on three quick things, and these are trends that we noticed in citizenship and nationality, and that's the issue of double registration, as Mariama mentioned earlier. And then there's also now the issue of digital ID registration going on in different parts of Africa, different parts of the world. And then specifically to Kenya, the issue of National Integrated Management System and the NEMI system, which makes sure that people have to be registered with birth certificates for them to attend school, which is then again continuing to provide an exclusionary provision. Next slide, Tobias. So yeah, the key takeaways from the learning exchange for us include that, as I mentioned, data is still important and a very key aspect into the work that we continue to do. And then, as I mentioned again, countries that work in this sphere as represented in the learning exchange seemed to have a colonial background, and which may then have gone ahead to entrench discrimination. The other thing that came out quite clearly was that there is need for practitioners to develop an organizational communication strategy that will optimize their program's efforts, and this should include both online and offline. And then finally, there was a very important need to identify and challenge the status quo by creating limits that we tend to jump most of the time. Civil society, in trying to engage and building good relationships with government and service providers, they may tend to replicate what government is doing. And this may affect our ability to check government as civil society. So those are last key takeaways that we had from the exchange. And then in the share with me the last slide, Tobias, please. So yeah, I'll go quickly through four successes. Next slide, Tobias. 5 successes that we had in the learning exchange that came out after the learning exchange was that we have countries that have gone ahead to involve participants in the Global Legal Empowerment Network. From South Africa, Indonesia, they've trained and joined and asked their colleagues to join the network. And then we've had, as I mentioned, the radio shows in Myanmar, which Yadana is leading. We also have radio shows with the Nubian Rights Forum and with Council of Minorities in Bangladesh. And then the learning exchange between Myanmar and Thailand is also a direct relation to the learning exchange in Kenya and the mobile birth registration in Ukraine. Those are all successes. Final slide, Tobias. So as we talk about the questions, I would like to challenge us in the next steps. Step number 1 is join the Global Legal Empowerment Network if you're not yet a member. And number 2, join and continue the conversation on the discourse post that will be shared and updated with the recording for the webinar. Thank you. I will now go ahead to address some of the questions that have been fielded for us.
If you want, you can all show your webcams again so that we can see all your lovely faces while you're answering the questions. We're down to 10 minutes for the formal part of the program, but there are a lot of questions still. So I want to suggest that maybe we could go over by 10 minutes. I don't know if the panelists are okay with that. And it would be nice to get some answers. And I noticed that Jane Marie is online from a former learning exchange. And there's some wonderful people here. Very happy to see you all.
Okay, so if I may jump in with first question. This is a question from Sunitha Bisan, and she wants to know the current Kenyan experience on climate refugees is interesting. Is there more insight on the litigation strategy? I think, Mariama, this one you will take, and maybe we could lead it with continued conversations on the discourse post, considering the amount of time we may need to go through it. So a quick answer is just that the refugee laws in Kenya have been expanded to include rights of asylum seekers and the refugee status due to the disasters that were related to climate or serious events disrupt the public order. Mariama continues to mention that she has worked on gender environment and governance.
Why don't you let Mariama? I wanted to suggest that you let Mariama answer the question. She's there.
Oh yeah, so that's basically it. The refugee laws in Kenya have just been expanded to include provisions for people who are escaping events related to natural disasters or events that might have been caused by climate change. I'm sure we can discuss this further on the platform, but that's the short answer, that our laws they've just been expanded to include these kind of citizens and refugees.
Thank you, Mariama. There was a question on the work that has come out of the exchange, and I think I addressed that by mentioning the different successes we've had. There is a question for Malini. So, Malini, do you know if any countries like Sri Lanka still have law in enforcing that allow stateless people to apply for citizenship? If they can prove their residence,
Sorry, Mohammed, I probably won't have that information, but if it was in regards to the presentation that I made to the law in amendment in 2003, it was specifically improving the residents of to acquire citizenship through linkages of who had arrived during 1964 from those arrived in 1964, 30th October, and the following descendants. So I believe that if any linkages were made to these descendants and proving your residency, that could be the possible. Yeah.
There is also a question for Irina, I think. Is the legislation in Ukraine similar?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. There is indeed similar legislation in Ukraine that demands the applicant to prove the linkage with the members of the family and their territorial link. But we have interesting development, that is the proposal from the parliament to cancel that provision in law, meaning that Ukraine is independent for another 28 years, and the government considers that this period was more than enough to exchange passports of former republic for the passports of independent Ukraine. But nevertheless, in our work, we can witness that thousands of people who reside in rural distant areas are still the holders of invalid Soviet passports. So there is indeed the problem, and I was just wondering if there is similar practice when the government just cut off the possibility to prove the link, territorial link to the country.
Thank you, Irina. I see there was also a mention of another question about the litigation strategy on the petition. I would assume in relation to the petition that the Nubian Rights Forum had filed against the government on the National Integrated Management System. So the strategy basically was to look at what the partners have. And in Kenya, we have a coalition for the Nubian Rights Forum are part of a coalition on citizenship and statelessness issues who went ahead to inform some of the work that is being carried out. I know that data from paralegal activity and paralegal work was collated to show that there was evidence of discrimination for those particular people going ahead. And there were different issues that were raised, the issue of data protection, because the new national identity registration system does not have data protection laws yet set in place. There were issues of inclusivity. There were issues of availability, like the registration centers where national integrated registration should be conducted, are not streamlined across the country. So there were a few issues that had been highlighted, and we can continue the discussion on the discourse post, where we can mention some of the things that I know the citizenship team, including my colleagues Laura and Mustafa from the citizenship program, have been doing towards that particular case. I see we still have about 5 minutes. Any more questions that you'd like us to address, or any points? And maybe even some of the participants of the exchange, if they're available. I know that Jen Mary is available, if they'd like to put in a quick sharing or a quick word. Tobias, anything else that you would want to share?
There are, let's see, I'm just looking through the questions that are still not answered. Vivek Trivedi had asked if there had been any joint projects that emerged. And I wonder, Irina, if you could answer that question.
Yeah, this is the another proof that the Learning Exchange is exclusive platform for uniting efforts and for the exchange of ideas, because during the exchange we realized that we have similar problem, that is discrimination of stateless people when they belong to certain ethnic minorities, and being inspired by the exchange in general, and in particular advocacy practices that were shared by lawyers from human rights, we decided to apply with the panel proposal for the International Conference on Statelessness and Inclusion that will be organized this year in Hague in the summer. And we applied with the topic on statelessness and discrimination, and it will enlighten the problem of practices that discriminatory practices that the government applies towards the ethnic minority groups. And this conference will also be the preparatory step for the midpoint of 10 years UNHCR campaign that is labeled I Belong.
Thank you, Irina. Let's see if there are any other questions. I know that Winfred had asked a bit more about, Winfred Kabatabazi had asked a bit more about the double registration, and she wanted to know, are there any incidences of refugees registering as nationals, and what are the reasons why they do this and how they have been helped? And I would like to throw this to Mariama to share again quickly.
So yeah, the double registered people does include Somalis from Somalia who are in the camps and who have managed to obtain Kenyan documents, mostly through networks of corruption. It's all very illegal. But the issue is now, as Kenya moves into a more digital platform and they're more aware of the documentation that they have, it's been more difficult. And keep in mind, this refugee camp has been hosted by Kenya for 27 years. So there's people who've been born in the camps on Kenyan soil and who don't know anything other than Kenya. So this is another angle that we're trying to add into our litigation strategy, that there are some people who, even if you said that they should be sent back to Somalia, they have no ties to the country. They're more Kenyan than Somali at this point. They were born in the camps. They've only lived within that environment. So it's valid to think about the Somalis from Somalia who also want to obtain Kenyan citizenship and how we can now try to include that in our litigation strategy. So thanks for bringing that up. I actually forgot to mention it. So thank you.
Thanks, Mariama. I think I can field, one more question that we have from Dorothy Aseo. Dorothy, you had a question? Okay, let's see who else. There was a question from all three presentations. Data collection and analysis was described as an important aspect of citizenship rights and advocacy, but also a challenge in all the three countries. Can you please describe what strategies you may have learned through the exchange on data collection and analysis, and how you may be using these lessons in your own work now? Mariama, want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So what we do an online platform where the paralegals migrate physical forms that they fill out in the field onto this online platform. What we've done now is to kind of try to push the data to serve particular purposes. Again, this follows the lessons that we learned from the exchange for our community work. It's also bled over into the way that we process our data. So now, instead of now just taking all the data as a whole, we try to streamline it and kind of filter it into what do we need that data for? Or are we just collecting this data just to have it? So yeah, it's been very helpful for us. It's a bit more tedious, obviously, but I think now that we have these systems in place, that we're collecting this particular data for this litigation strategy, or we're collecting this data to affect policy change, or we're collecting this data to inform how the government will deliver, I don't know, some services or whatever. But yeah, that's how we've been doing it now after the exchange.
Yeah, thanks. I should note that most of the participants of the exchange had some form of data collection strategy, either through an online platform. I know that we had a participant from Uganda, Isaac, who they shared a very interesting mobile data collection tool. There was also one, I think, Malini, if you could mention quickly about your data collection tool in DRA.
Yeah, so we do have a database that is known as MyDraw, where we collect data, and we've got about 12,000 over data fed into the database. And the database then it translates into a dashboard where we can derive certain statistics, and especially about types of applications and the time that it takes for processing each application. And during the exchange, one of the advocacy tactics that I really learned was how to break down the data collected and turning it into an advocacy message, but something much simpler to display any sort of discrimination that might be present. So previously I might have been using it as a whole data presentation, that 12,000 data out of this is etc., etc. But rather now I try to go on a smaller scale of discrimination patterns, and really putting out the message that these are the impacts that we're facing, apart from putting a lump sum statelessness number out there. So that's one of the key learnings that I've had.
And so now we would like to respect everyone's time. I know we're about 5 minutes out. So I would like to thank all the presenters. They were really a lovely group in the exchange, and I'm sure they have done the rest of the participants of the Learning Exchange proud. I will continue to share the slides with you. Now, this brings us to the end of the formal part of our webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for the excellent points raised and the questions asked. Thank you, Tobias and Madeline, for helping with taking notes and filling the questions. And I would like to invite you all to become members of the Global Legal Empowerment Network at namati.org. We will be in touch by email with a reminder invitation also, and share the link for the full recording in today's proceedings. And let us keep this conversation going in the network. Thank you all, and have a nice rest of your day or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. It's been a great pleasure. It's been a wonderful collaboration.
Thank you.